Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Gameweek 13 team selection. I've locked my free hit. I don't think there's much more information really to go in terms of how my free hit can change. So I feel pretty comfortable saying that my draft is exactly the same draft that I shared within the previous video. As ever, there's going to be comments complaining that it is the same draft as everyone else's, but I do think that this is one of the free hits that does pick itself very easily. And at least from a data perspective, it's hard to sort of go around the pick. So I'll probably do the point of defending each pick and how boring it is in this video, because I just think it's a pretty good approach to go about it. The one sort of pick that I think can change is probably how I approach the city attacker, because I think there's interesting debates around that, and we can obviously move into that quite quickly. But yeah, I think the only pending news that we could possibly get is some Liverpool news potentially. I don't think Slot seems to be someone who's going to get sacked, given that he's not been sacked already. So it might be the West Ham result that really does him in. Does that mean I'm going to go no Liverpool? I don't think so, actually. I still think, looking at the games, look at the underlying data. Yes, have Liverpool been an absolute car crash in terms of defense? Yes. Have they struggled to score? They, for the most part, have. But they've actually built some XG, right? So when you look at the underlying data at the tail of the tape, I just think West Ham have not been a good defense this season. Liverpool have at least been a decent offense this season, and they've been pretty terrible for their own standards on defense. So if there's a place that I'm going to attack, it's still Liverpool attack. And all the other fixtures this week, perfect segue to jumping into that. At the same time, if you find my draft boring, if you want to have a look at like inspiration for how you can approach the draft differently, have a look at the link in the description below. Fantasy Football Hub do have their My Team AI rating tool, which will include also their kind of perfect 100% AI rated draft. I'm not going to share that here because my draft is my draft, but there's those tools available to you, even the opportunity to kind of plan transfers around the free hit, right? Which is something that we tend to do within the transfer plans video with the My Team pick and rating tool. Cool. Let's just jump into the updated odds for this week. I think what I would say about this week is, as I've tried to say, when you look at, let's say, like a model's approach, right? I think 11.5 is interesting in the sense that, from a general sort of model perspective, I think the difference between where he evaluates some team strengths versus the markets would be maybe he's a little bit lower in United, he's a little bit higher on Palace, he's definitely a little bit higher on Brentford from memory. And these are the kind of trends that you can bring towards looking at the prediction. So I think even in spite of all this, I think the key thing to mention is that this is still a pretty mediocre week for a Crystal Palace clean sheet from that perspective, right? 28% is not exactly close to any of the other top picks this week. Like even Arsenal defense, excuse me, have better clean sheet odds. Now, what's interesting, I suppose, 11.5's model has always been higher on Arsenal defense. But is there an opportunity for me to go Aston Villa defense over Arsenal defense? Absolutely. And same with Brentford defense and same with City defense, right? So I think when I kind of look at things like that and kind of know the context of, using both my understanding of market odds, which you can obviously find through Rob T as well on Twitter, and just looking at 11.5's match predictions this week, to me, I still think it's very hard to justify like wanting to sidestep some of these key fixtures. Like, sure, of course, I'm invested into 4 fixtures, but I think a really good FPL discussion that actually came out earlier this week was Trout's discussion of the concept of risk on a free hit, right? The idea that if you're, let's say, more invested into certain teams and certain players, and even, let's say, certain actions, right? So what do I mean by that? So if you're invested into, let's say, 3 or 4 teams, as opposed to, let's say, all 10 teams on a free hit, which means you have a less diversified free hit from a team perspective, you are kind of, yes, of course, hedging on, or not really hedging, but rather betting on these teams to do well. But it makes a lot of sense from a ceiling perspective because you're kind of hoping for maximum results. Whereas if you're betting on 10 different results, you kind of need, it's a lot higher for, I guess, 10 different results to go your way than, let's say, if I went double or triple Aston Villa defense and needed one result to be ubiquitous, right? So Aston Villa to get a clean sheet or Brentford to get a clean sheet. I think what we have at present as well with some of the fixture gulfs with Brentford versus Burnley or City versus Leeds is that the fixture gap is so large for me on a week like this that it still makes sense to have a slightly diversified team. You do not have to stack triple defense, in my opinion, or triple attack from certain teams. I still think that there are some picks, for example, like O'Reilly is a great example of that, who is both an attacker and a defender for City. So really you're invested into City attack, but you get the off benefit of getting clean sheet odds. With some of the Brentford attackers, I just think There's no other fixture this week that screams such a good fixture on paper because Burnley really are diabolical in defense, and I'm going to rest on that, you know? So if, yes, Wolves get a win or Burnley get a win, sure, that's going to hurt the free hit. But from a data perspective, I'm happy to take on that sort of risk because I'd like to back good, strong results on already great expectations for teams, hoping that I can sort of maximize that ceiling. So that's kind of how I feel about the odds. As you can see with the other games like Sunderland versus Bournemouth, it's a decent Bournemouth clean sheet opportunity, I suppose. Nottingham Forest, that seems like a very low score in both teams to score type of game. Everton versus Newcastle pretty much appears exactly like that. Spurs versus Fulham too. So other than maybe like if you're really invested into Arsenal, but I think what's impressive about this week is, I watched Chelsea play versus Barcelona. I was very impressed with how Chelsea played. And I feel like even coming out of watching Arsenal versus Bayern, if anything, it speaks to the strength of the Premier League because I think Bayern really didn't challenge Arsenal too much. And I actually think Chelsea will give them a much better game, especially since it's going to be, reverse, right? Home at Chelsea at Stamford Bridge versus, let's say, Bayern playing at the Emirates. So that's kind of how I feel about it. And it's a good litmus test to see exactly how dominant Arsenal are because, of course, they have dropped some points so far, but for the most part, they've been far and far better than any other team in the league. And Chelsea's sort of a team picking up some form where they had some slips, like, for example, the loss versus Sunderland, but have recuperated quite well within recent matches and seem to be hitting stride themselves. So in defense, I'm going to go Martinez, Collins, Cash, O'Reilly. I think to defend the picks, Collins versus Vandenberg is the biggest source of debate for myself internally because I would say, Collins, his assistive numbers in terms of XAG within the last 365 days is higher than Vandenberg's, but Vandenberg's had higher XG. Now, Vandenberg, interestingly, is a negative finisher. I'm sure a lot of people will not like the idea of discussing being a negative finisher when you're a center back, because what does that even mean? It just means that he's missed, I think, over the life of his pretty short career so far, because he's a pretty young player, where he's racked up reasonably decent XG. He is actually negative right now in terms of converting that. So I think he's minus 3.5 in terms of league play. He's racked up 8.5 XG in his league career. So that's pretty significant. But someone can also claim that that's not enough sample size, right? Someone, I guess underscoring close to 4 goals when they only should have scored 9. Is that enough? Maybe that's a good or bad season for some players, and we've seen huge swings. But that could be a thing. From the eye test, I'd say Collins is still probably the focal point in terms of set pieces, but as I said, Vandenberg has actually gotten the chances, as it turns out. But yeah, I think I'll go for Collins because he just has marginally better DEFCON, and I can afford Collins, and that's all. And that's all I'm going to rest on. I also think most people will go Vandenberg, so the additional pieces, I suppose, Collins is actually not going to be on a lot of free hits. I think because most people are just going to back Vandenberg and go for him. With Cash, I think the tricky thing with Villa is that it could be interesting to go for someone like Dean, but what I like about Cash is he plays more minutes and, you don't deal with that sort of Maatsen 45 substitution. How many times have we seen that before with Aston Villa where things just aren't clicking within a match and you see that substitution, or even Dean's, miraculously benched, because it could be the case that they rotate a little bit ahead of the midweek game. Whereas I think with Cash, you don't have that real difficulty. And he's the only one producing sort of any sort of tangible underlying stats from a defensive point of view for Villa. So I do like going for Cash from that perspective. And also I do like going Martinez because I think there's a lot more Brentford defenders with higher ceilings in terms of attack this week, so it makes more sense for my goalkeeper to be Martinez. Going back to the Collins piece, Coyote's another Brentford pick who's probably interesting. My only issue with Coyote is, lack of DEFCON, really. He's actually really good at baseline BPS, and obviously we know he is the best long thrower in the league, but, the long throws should hopefully land on some of the center backs. So we'll also see how that goes. But yeah, I'm going to sit on Collins for now. With O'Reilly, people have been asking about Nunez. Simply, I think O'Reilly just has much better underlying stats. And this is not just the season, but actually just, historically as well, right? So O'Reilly, to me, is much more appealing as a pick. He's done slightly better than Nunez this season. I think both players have racked up 1 goal, 1 assist at least. I think O'Reilly with maybe 2 assists. But his underlying stats are far clear, right? He actually has tangible XG per 90, good XAG per 90 as well. And, it's far clearer, for example, like someone like a Guardiola who doesn't even get DEFCON. So is there any reason for me to even tempt myself with Guardiola? No. Nunez could be interesting just because he's probably the largest differential. But I think O'Reilly just is the most sensible because I think he's got the highest expected points as a City defender. And as I said, you kind of have that double-pronged threat because one of the issues with the City attackers is you always know that they play slightly reduced minutes, whereas I think O'Reilly's guaranteed to play a 90. And that's pretty much how I'd rest my case on defense. In the midfield, I think the only pick that I'm slightly uncertain on, And it could change, right? I suppose if there's a Liverpool presser and there's a bit of, I don't know, a hinting of whether Salah and Gakpo could get rotated with the already thin team as it is, maybe Chiesa starts or something like that. Like, sure, that's plausible, but I still think Salah and Gakpo are good, for the most part, going to play 90 minutes. I think they're kind of forced to. And it is still West Ham, as I said. Like, I think, yes, of course, West Ham are on a bit of a run themselves. Like, they've been scoring goals, but it's not like they've been completely, fault free in terms of defense. Like, they've conceded 2 goals to Burnley. Versus Newcastle, they were actually quite dominant, but I think Newcastle had a pretty weak team in terms of like they just didn't even have functional fullbacks, although you can make the same complaint about Liverpool this season, which is fair. I just think, yeah, looking at XGC, West Ham's numbers have not really been like super improved under Nuno, so I'll still target Liverpool from that perspective. Liverpool have still posted decent XG, as I said, within their recent matches, but they haven't really converted some of them. So, for example, versus PSV, yes, they scored a goal and it was a bit of a tap in from Sobo, but I think they racked up at least 2.7 XG within that match. And I still think that if you get the right minutes from the Liverpool players, it's a good logical decision on this week to actually go for them. Because am I going to shop for a Nottingham Forest midfielder? Probably not. Am I going to shop for Ismaila Sarr if I think Gakpo has got 95 minutes in the bank? Also, probably not. So that's kind of where I stand right now. But I think Sarr is interesting. And as I mentioned previously, Sobo also interests me. With the Foden position, going back to that point, I do think there's some doubts on Foden. This is a season where I think the markets have moved a little bit in terms of at least identifying that Foden is not as productive as a player as we probably think. But then from a minutes perspective, I think he still sort of trumps Doku and Cherki, right? So Cherki's minutes this week, I think, are probably somewhere around 65 minutes, just because you need to factor in that Cherki is someone who always gets an early sub. There's a midweek fixture as well. And Doku, of course, I think, who's been quintessential to the team actually winning games, he still gets subbed very early. So, for example, with that masterpiece game versus Liverpool, he still got subbed off at, I think, 77 minutes. So it's not like his minutes are perfect. But of course, both these players have racked up really good underlying stats, per 90 this season compared to Foden, who hasn't. The only thing that we can rest on Foden is he's just a really good finisher from an underlying perspective. And can we bank on Foden versus, I guess, a weaker team? Like Leeds, if I was to sort of be fair to them, I don't think they've been any good away from home this season. So when I look at, for example, away numbers in terms of XGC, I think Leeds are close to the bottom and have very similar numbers to Man United and Bournemouth, right? Both teams that we've targeted as being horrendous away, and Burnley are far at the bottom. But that's because they're far at the bottom for everything, right? They're just a bad defense overall, and that's why we're targeting them with 2 Brentford attackers. I just don't see this as an opportunity to double up on Brentford defense when Burnley are the worst defense in the league. And players like Shade have racked up good numbers. Players like Thiago have racked up good numbers, and they're on penalties, and they have penalty share. And for me, where I edge Shade versus Dango is just purely on minutes. So I'll take that to the bank. As far as Foden, I think that what I will say is that this could still be maybe Ryan Cherki. Because I feel like Cherki's interesting where if there's a gamble, I could probably say Cherki has some form of, like, I guess, set piece share at times. He is also someone who has always had great underlying stats, whereas Doku, this is sort of his breakout season. It's hard to sort of think, okay, is Doku going to be on this monumental pace and is Foden going to be completely off the pace for the whole season? So right now I'm sitting on Foden, but all of these players are sort of within question. And I think we'll get a leak, right? We'll get a leak confirming if someone like Cherki starts, and I might pivot Foden to Cherki. But everyone on this draft, unfortunately, in the midfield, I think also picks itself, because when I look at someone like Rodgers, none of the Aston Villa midfielders have shown any sparks of life other than sort of like 1 or 2 good moments. Like Malin had a great game versus Burnley, or Buendia scored a great free kick versus Bournemouth, and has generally been pretty productive this season for Aston Villa. But the minutes just aren't there for me to sort of justify, going for someone like Buendia. If I knew Buendia was going to play 90 minutes, I probably would actually chance him over someone like, a Rodgers, because I think they've both come to 3 goals, 2 assists this season, and Buendia's basically played half the minutes as Rodgers. Obviously, I think scoring a free kick is technically overperformance, although Rodgers has done the same, right? I think already within the season, I think Buendia's underlying stats are actually better than Rodgers with the reduced minutes. So not even looking at per 90s, but actually just the flat numbers so far. So something to kind of think about in terms of that sort of perspective. But does that make me still want to go Buendia, who could play 45 minutes on a certain match? Probably not. I'd back Rodgers. And I think like his underlying stats look abysmal. I mean, 8 XG per 90, 10 XAG per 90 also look way too low. In the past, even last season, he was close to 0.2, 0.2. So it's kind of hard for me to believe that he, like Rodgers, is performing at the level where we expect him to continue sort of playing at the season. I think he can definitely have those numbers, get pumped up. So I feel pretty comfortable going for Rodgers here in the draft. And then moving up to the front line, or actually maybe just closing on the point with Gakpo, there is an opportunity now with Ekitike injured that maybe Isak will play 90 minutes. But then something I'm thinking about too is, it's not like Isak has been, he's really struggled with Liverpool this season. He's had, close to no underlying stats so far. He's not on penalties. I think he's had 1 assist this season. Gakpo's actually had some really good underlying stats. And, I as a midfielder, he benefits from that perspective too. So I probably think I would just go Gakpo because he doesn't hamstring my draft from a budget perspective as much as Isak would. So I think I am keen on playing 3-5-2 this week specifically because of, how the free hit is going to play itself. And then in the front line, it's Haaland, Thiago, it's Gu. There's nothing to say. My auto subs, because I just want to make sure that everything's fine, is Petrovic, Senesi, and Reynaldo. 2 good auto subs who should have decent potential to get points, like regardless of the situation. Obviously, it's a mirror matchup, but they're better auto subs than I can probably get from other teams for similar prices. Like for Senesi, I think the key thing here is clean sheet odds are slightly higher than Palace's, similar to Liverpool's, and he's got equivalent DEFCON potential to a Virgil, and he's at a cut rate price. And versus Richards, as I said, I'm kind of resting on the clean sheet percentage there. And the same thing with going for Petrovic, where once again, if you were to target a team like Sunderland, they're just not a very good attack. And I think even their home numbers for attack, even though we kind of signal them as a great home team, are not very good. They're, I think, bottom 3 in terms of XG at home. Of course, Bournemouth are, I think, second worst in the league when it comes to XGC away. But I do think it kind of levels out for the price point for the fixture. So I'll happily have 2 Bournemouth players on the bench, but that's going to be my free hit. It's hard to see how my head will get turned. As I said, I think there's a lot of picks that I've considered in my mind. It's hard to justify getting to them though, other than for the sake of wanting to be different. For the most part, I think I spent a lot of the rest of the season being different from other managers and having different teams, going for different moves where I see fit. So, on a free hit like this, where, as I said, I think it does pick itself a little bit, I'm happy to go with the draft like this. So thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys soon. Take care and goodbye.